All right, we're going to start looking into fall pasture considerations for our one of our first classes for our 2020 Master Beef class. Um, when you start getting into some of these things, there's lots of different options and lots of different strategies, and it's one of those things where the old logic comes. It's half dozen of one, six of another. So there's not always a right strategy. There's a strategy that's right for your farm, and you have to decide what is best for your farm and for your time. Everybody has different schedules. Everybody has different flexibilities, and so those are all part of this pie. So when somebody says you need to do this, that's just because that's their favorite type of pie, and that doesn't mean it's going to work for you. What we're going to try to get to on deck is just talk about optimizing our grass, and not necessarily what we can do in this purposefully, but what can we do to realize what's going on in the grass. What is nature's optimum grass strategy? We'll try to look through selecting that right option. Obviously there's not a perfect option, but there's a right option for you. We'll look at a couple of different options and see which one you think will work best. Well, we get into the stockpiling versus hay. This is always a common thought for each one of these. We don't always get this option every year because Mother Nature doesn't always cooperate. I'm hoping we're going to be very fortunate this fall to have some options. Last year, we didn't really have any of these options. So this is going to give us some options to be able to apply some of these strategies. We'll look at fall and winter spring. This is one of those golden times that I think we miss. We typically think spring is a good time because that's when we can see those weeds, but this is one of those opportunities that you'll find might better fit your schedule and have more success. And then we'll spend just one quick slide, probably kind of getting quick thoughts on getting started. So what are some strategies? And I think that's more going to be an opportunity for us to have some discussions, because that's the ultimate goal of this presentation, is to get you guys discussing and then talking about it. So we're going to try to keep it as short as possible because I want, like I said, I mentioned before, we want to break it up and be able to have a good discussion by each season rather than just getting it all at one time. So when you look at this picture, this is probably what you're going to see in the spring. Right now, if you start looking at it, it's covered in some warm season annual grasses. You probably got crabgrass, Johnson grass, lots of other nice little warm season weeds out there. Then pretty soon you're going to see that just be covered in mud. And this is typically what we're going to start to see in early spring. But what you see right there is very spotty pieces of grass, and you have lots of opportunities for your weeds to start to prevail. If you have these spots, something's going to grow there, and the grass is not going to spontaneously, like fescue, is not going to spontaneously start to grow there. So if you don't put it there, weeds are going to take the opportunity to grow there. And so as we get into this, we'll talk a little bit about, do you spray or no spray? What is the key to having a successful pasture, hayfield, whatever you want to have. And it's not necessarily spraying or no spraying, it's competition. In the end, competition is the key to this entire game. And, the good news is when you provide the right strategy, when you provide the right nutrients, the good guys will win. One of the things that I really like to look at, if you've been to a UT event, if you've been to a UT presentation, I'm guessing that you have seen this slide, but I think this slide does an outstanding job. So if you haven't seen this slide, this does a really good job of showing a comparison of when you pick different strategies and pick different places to put your money when money is tight, and like it is now when the cattle market's down. You want to optimize where you put your money. And this is a great illustration of that. So when you're looking at this, you don't have to necessarily understand every bit of it, but know that percentage of your ground cover, if you start here on the left-hand side, that is numbers regarding the percentage of ground cover. And that is if you did nothing on the very left-hand side, if you did nothing, and running along the x-axis is the nutrients or the inputs we're going to put in. If you did nothing, your weeds, which is the red line, are going to be overtaking the grass. and your clover is going to be kind of running pretty low. If you'll add phosphorus and potassium, you start to see you get an increase in your grass, and your weed pressure starts to go down. So you're starting to optimize the nutrients for your grass. Your clover starts to go up. If you start to come across, you add phosphorus, potassium, and lime, you start to see your grass is increasing slightly, but what more importantly is your weed pressure is going down. When you add phosphorus, potassium, lime, and a fertilizer, your grass really takes off. Your weeds come down, and you'll also see some of your clover coming down because your grass is overtaking. So what does all this mean is that when you get optimum environments for your grass, it's going to overtake weeds. The good thing about weeds is, they're the little man on the court. So if you can box them out, if you can put a lot of pressure on them with some really healthy, active grass, they're going to outcompete the weeds. And the same goes for some other things that we're going to talk about. I think I saw in the question box something about sage. Sage is a very opportunistic grass. It's going to take advantage when it's hot and dry. So in 2016 and 2019 last year, we saw sage really start to thrive. That's because the fescue grass was really starting to go downhill, and the sage grass took that opportunity to really start to move forward. You'll look at this fall, I'll bet you'll see a lot less sage grass when you have a nice, thick, healthy stand of grass out there to outcompete the sage grass. You won't see near as much sage grass. So when that becomes okay, what's the key to that environment? And so when we start to look at it is we start to see where some of these nutrients that we just talked about, we talked about adding nitrogen, we talked about adding phosphorus, and we talked about adding lime. Where does that play a role in? Well, that plays a role in the grass. So the more that we add the appropriate amount for the grass, the stronger that grass is, the better it's able to thrive in the environment. The key is it has to have the right pH. And you've heard somebody talk about this nonstop is, about putting lime on the ground. The key optimum thing is make sure that you get your pH above 6.0. If your pH in your pasture is below 6.0, you've set it up in an environment so that the weeds have a better chance to grow than the grass. And it's just like going to the doctor. If you want him to just guess and tell you what's going on inside of your body, there's a few signs that he can look at and see. But most likely he's going to ask you to run some blood tests because he wants to know what's going on in there. So you can either just have him guess and just say, this based on my best recommendations of what I'm seeing, this is what we're going to do for you. Or you can actually go through and get the blood test to kind of give you a better idea of what's actually going on inside. No different with the grass. We can take a look at the environment and see what's going on. Or we can start to look at doing some tests because we need to know what that pH is. If you've got a pH of 6.0, that's the minimum. That's all we have to have. Ideally, we like 6 to 6.5 on our pH. That's going to give our grass an opportunity to really thrive and outcompete the weeds. Grass does better at 6.0 and above. Weeds do better at 6 or at 5.9 and below. So if you get that to 6.0, this graph tells you is it starts to tell you that when it's at 6.0, grass can start to actually use the nitrogen you're putting in there. Grass can start to use the phosphorus that you're putting in there. What you'll know, and grass can start to use the potassium. What happens is if your pH is below 6.0, you can put all those nutrients in the ground and then are not as available to the grass. So they're not going to use them to their max capacity, even though you put on there. So you put everything that was needed out there, except you didn't get the lime right, or you didn't put lime down, and the pH was around 5.5. So even if you put all those nutrients down, the grass isn't going to be able to use them. So it's really important that you get your pH to 6, you find out what your pH is, get to 6, and then start to come through and put down the right nutrients. And that's kind of where we get into this. We kind of got into a little bit on the doctor side. they're not doing everything based just on sight. They order tests, they order MRIs, blood tests, everything else. And that's the same thing here. We can't, our land can't tell us everything. It can give us an idea what might be going on, but you can't tell us everything. And so if you are plan on putting any type of nutrients, or if your field, looks like it might be struggling in some aspects, you've got really strong weeds, it doesn't necessarily have to mean that your pH is below 6. Weeds aren't a perfect indicator that your pH is below 6, but they are one of those signs, just like going to the doctor. They are one of the signs that potentially you have, a lower pH. That doesn't mean that every year you need to go out and get a soil test. You don't get a blood test every year if you don't have any signs. So, if you are cutting hay, you'll probably want to, and putting more nutrients back in the ground consistently, and taking more nutrients off the ground, you'll want to get a soil test probably every 3-4 years, just to make sure that you're getting the right environment, the right pH. So as you put more of those nutrients on the ground, they're getting utilized. If you're not putting many nutrients in there, if you've got a lot of clovers, and you did a soil test and you got your pH above 6, you might not have to test for a while. So it's not something you have to do consistently. More frequently if you're taking hay off, but you at least need a starting basis for it. And it just means consider the amount of money that you put in it with nutrients. You want to make sure that you're getting it right. They're not free, and you want to get your max value. The cattle aren't returning the prices that we need, so this is a good place to start. In the end, the forages, and we're going to talk about forage nutrition a little later this year as we get into November, I believe. We'll start taking it from the cattle aspect of it and trying to utilize one of our number one cost savers. Okay, so when it comes to that, now we got to get to actually a point of time where we're actually going to try to save and select some of those forages. So when you start thinking about the forages that you're going to do, what's the strategy that you're looking to do for your farm? We get into picking the right forage. We hear grasses, and you hear legumes. Legumes might be your clover, your alfalfa. Grasses, anywhere from a perennial cool season like fescue or orchard grass, to a annual that might be like rye or wheat or oats, to a warm season grass that could be Bermuda grass. So, or we get into crabgrass as an annual warm season. So there's lots of different options, and it can quickly be overwhelming when you start looking at all the different grasses, and then you start seeing mixtures, and what's a good mixture, what grass seeds can you plant at the same time? When do you plant certain grass seeds? Can you plant them all at the same time? It can get pretty overwhelming. And so rather than trying to dive into the planting periods for every one of these grasses and every one of these strategies, let's just pick what can we do today? What can we do today? Because we can't go out and plant Bermuda today. So we're going to take that one out of the holster. We can plan for it. We can think about it if we want to use some warm season grasses, but there's nothing that we can actively do today to be able to start growing a Bermuda grass pasture. So let's talk about what we can do today. Today we're looking at cool season grasses. We're coming into the fall season. We're going to have some opportunities. So we have to decide, are we going to start looking at some cool season perennials, which are grasses that appear year after year? Are we going to look at some legumes like clover? Are we going to look at some annual grasses like rye and oats and wheat that we have to plant every year and that terminate at the end of the growing season? So those are options that we have to make. They are options that you have to decide what works best for your strategy. You start getting into some of these. Some are more labor intensive than others. These are typically some ones that are pretty popular in this area. We talked about these tall fescue orchard grass. When I talk about orchard grass, we talk about orchard grass almost exclusively as a hay forage. It really just does not have any persistence, any long-term sustainability as a grazing forage, but it can be a very popular pasture or hay forage, it's still, even as a hay forage, has a pretty short-term life. Just in this transition zone that we live in Tennessee, it's very difficult to grow. We start to look at some of the annual ones. These have, these are can be utilized in the right strategies. We get into wheat, rye, annual ryegrass, oats, perennials. You see Bermuda, you get a lot of common Bermuda, and then you get into pearl millet, crabgrass, sorghum sudan, and even our good friend Johnson grass. It's one of those necessary evils that we have. There's a reason why it's most readily available, why it grows so well, because this is the environment that it grows so well in. So rather than necessarily fighting it all along the way, it's maybe finding a better way to understand it, better way to utilize it in your program. So one thing that I think is always important, and we've talked about this quite frequently, but I don't think it's one that you can just you can just forget about. Actually, it's very prominent, and I think we do forget about it. But there's pounds of gain, dollars lost every year, where we could utilize some different strategies to help mitigate this loss. So we start talking about tall fescue. So a lot of us are going to be talking about this fall, starting to plant tall fescue um, in our fields. So we're going to try to do some reseeding or overseeding, maybe even some new seeding based on the last few years. And tall fescue, good old Kentucky 31, is going to be that fescue that we use. It's high quality. It is the longest lasting one that we have. It has the greatest persistence. Um, but what makes that persistence, what allows it to be able to stay, is it has what we call endophyte. Endophyte is inside the the plant, inside the plant, that allows it to actually sustain. And so I don't believe we have a slide here, but what it can cause is a toxicosis. And so um, some of the signs that you will typically see, and you probably don't necessarily recognize it, but you know when you see those cattle that just aren't doing as well. But during the summer, you're going to see it raises their blood temperature, and so you'll see them spending more time in the water if there's a pond available. You're going to see them spending less time eating. You're going to see some of the animals that don't do well on it are going to have shaggy coats. And so when you have when you have that increased blood temperature, they're not able to regulate their blood as well, so they can't cool themselves. So when you eat, you cause yourself to increase the amount of heat. So what do you not want to do? You don't want to eat. And so that's where we start to see when you start looking at animals that might be gaining in the spring 2 pounds per day on grass, maybe even close to that during the fall. You start to see in summer and early fall, they might be gaining only a pound. They're going to come back off an entire pound that you're losing on a probably 3 or 4 or 5 months out of the year, that you're losing on each one of those animals, especially if you got some young steers or heifers out on pasture. But there's different ways to mitigate that. One of them is including clover in your strategy. That kind of dilutes out the endophyte that is in all fescue that you'll see. The more you can include some different clovers into your strategy, that dilutes it out, gives you back a half a pound. How does a half a pound sound today? When you start looking at the market and what it costs, and what does it cost to raise or to put a bale of hay out there. So um, these are little things that when you look at them individually, they're just little individual aspects of it. But when you start piling them up, they start to add to lots of different opportunities for gain or for loss. So as you're starting to go through that planning strategy, realize tall fescue, the great thing about it, it sustains, at least it sustains the best out of all the grasses we have. Bad thing about it is it's related to toxicosis. So think about some mitigating strategies that you can have, either putting another warm season grass out there and trying to graze that during a lot of the summer, or adding some clovers to our pastures to dilute that out. Give us another half pound back. And so we start to get in there. You see some different opportunities to do it. We won't get too much into the novel endophyte or endophyte free. um, just real quick, endophyte free, is they took the endophyte out of it. They took that poisonous, or they took that part that was actually causing the toxicosis. And what happened is it became just like all the other grasses. It would not survive the summer. So it had to have the endophyte in there to be able to survive and to be able to last. So that didn't work. Then they came up with this novel endophyte that was actually, they found somewhere, I believe in New Zealand. It was actually a good endophyte. So it would allow the endophyte to actually stay. It would allow the fescue to actually or last and persist, but without the negative effects. The problem was it's very expensive, and if you live next to a field, if you go cut a field somewhere else and you bring your bush hog over there, you bring your hay mower over there, and you start cutting in this newly planted novel endophyte infected tall fescue, all of a sudden you have the infected stuff now with your new field, and shortly you will have a regular old Kentucky 31 infected tall fescue. So in very rare strategies did it actually work, only where you can completely isolate from yourself and not be risking infection, transmitting it from other fields. So good product, just didn't work. So when we start looking at that, clovers were some of our best options for being able to utilize this stuff. One of the things, as you can kind of see here on this slide, is just the effect on game per acre. You see between just the spring and the fall, the difference, and that's it's quite relevant. If you start tracking some of your cattle, you can very easily track this. When you start talking about going from 2 pounds a day to 1 pound a day, but just on a side note, there's starting to be some very, very interesting research that's coming out, and they're starting to complete some of these studies, and they're starting to identify some of the genes that I know in the Angus, or the red Angus, has actually been doing some research for the University of Missouri at a couple of farms here in Tennessee, where they've been tracking a gene for how well cows actually do, or how well cattle actually do on fescue. And so if they're able to identify some of these genes, you'll be able to go through and select for animals that do better on endophyte infected pastures versus others. Now, right now, you could probably already select those. If you had a cow that always kept her hair coat, just didn't ever look very good during the summer, had a poor calf during the summer, didn't cycle back. That's another big issue. They're not cycling. You probably got rid of her. And the cow that was really thriving during the summer, she probably looked pretty good. More than likely, we're probably going to find that she had a gene to be able to do better on endophyte fescue. So it's one of those things. Rather than trying to find ways to get rid of fescue, you're better off to find a strategy to utilize it and find animals that do better on it than you are to just try to fight it. This is the grass that we have. We are in what we call a transition zone. Tennessee is cool season grasses. It's too hot for cool season grasses, and it's too cold for all the warm season grasses. So we fight to have a grass that'll be able to provide season long growth for us. So fescue's here to stay. Let's find the cattle that work really well for that. And so the good news is there's starting to be some research that's coming out, and so I'm hopefully that'll be a gene we can select for and identify on down the line, and we can start building some of our herds to do better on fescue pastures. I think it's important to realize how grass grows. I have used this numerous times. I'm sure lots of people have used this numerous times, but it's important when you're out there looking at your grass. How does it grow? Well, it starts out as that little tiny plant here down here at the bottom, what we call in phase one. And if you've been through, who knows, it's probably second grade, but it's maybe third grade science. We talked about photosynthesis. Plants grow by sunlight. The more surface area, the more leaf surface area they have, the more a bigger net that they have to catch the sunlight, the faster they can grow. So when you start looking at a plant like this, it's just starting to grow, or has been grazed back to this couple inches in the ground, it doesn't have a very big net. And so it's trying to grab what it can. It's fighting, and more than likely, it doesn't have the tools to really survive or to be the big fish and to really outcompete some of those big weeds that we see during the summer. So it's growing because all the energy is actually buried in the roots. And, as we talked about, they don't grow by energy from the roots. They grow by energy it receives from the sunlight to the leaves. So the key is we don't want our grass at this stage. You can't help it when you plant it. You want to get it from this stage to the next stage, phase 2, as quick as possible. But if you're at phase 2 and you don't want your grass going backwards too far into phase 1 if you're grazing it. If you do, it's not going to recover as long. Or if you get in the summer, it's going to really stress out, and that's when we lose a lot of our grasses. We get them where they're overgrazed and they don't have any capacity to be able to regrow. So phase 2 is ideal. That's where we like to be. If we can stay there, let's stay there. So that's where the strategy comes in, is phase 2 to phase 3. That's when you're transitioning from trying to grow to be for nutrition. You get into reproductive phases. So you're getting a growth phase. The growth phase is where you have the most nutrients, the highest quality nutrients. You go from growth to reproduction. That's when you get to seed head. All the energy goes into the seed head. The quality of the leaf goes down. The quality of the plant goes down. So the key is can you keep that plant from going into reproductive stage, whether it's through mowing or grazing, whatever that may be. So, for fescue, that's a good idea. Let's try to keep it between 3 and 8-9 inches. So if you can keep it from going to seed, and then make sure that you pull them off before it gets to 3 inches, you'll be in pretty good shape. The same goes when you're starting to put those animals back on there after you plant. Don't put them out here. Ideally, don't put them out there when that plant's still the size of this little phase 1 plant. It doesn't have a very big root system. It's not ready to be grazed yet. So it won't take much to be able to destroy that little plant. You get into phase 2, you're starting to get a good root system. So that may be, if you're planting this fall, that may be later this winter or later this spring that we start to see a good opportunity to graze that. So the longer you can give it a break and let it get settled, the better. Give it better root system, give it better time to really start to grow. So we talked about going into fescue, and we talked about trying to plant some perennials. Well, let's look in, when do we use these annuals? We probably, some of us probably have seen some of these sites like this. Obviously this is probably towards the middle of spring. So where we were feeding that hay, all of a sudden we've got a weed patch there. It went from just a mud hole to a dirt patch to covered with pigweed and spiny amaranth, and everything that we can get under the sun is starting to come on here. So when do we start to apply some of those annual strategies, annual grass strategies? Oops. Sorry, we're trying to find the right one. Okay. So when you start to use annuals, you have a couple of different options, and some of them are going to come on a little bit earlier this winter. Others are going to come on, more towards spring, and other early spring, and then others are going to really work towards late fall or late spring. And so it's trying to pick, what strategy works best for you. What is going on in your farm that tells you what you want. Wheat's going to start to peak a little bit earlier. You can start to get into some oats and rye grass that will start to peak a little bit later. And so for your farm, where do you need the most amount of forage? Do you need it early spring? Do you need it late winter? Do you need it late spring? And that can help you decide which annual to go to. An annual grass is not for everybody, but it certainly can be in the right spots. So if you're feeding hay in an opportunity where you're using one point source, let's say you're just putting a round bale feeder out there, this one's moving it around a little bit, but you're still probably not, more than likely, most of these started out as having the capacity, some genius put wheels on them. But for some reason they lack the capacity to actually roll once we roll them out there. So they become kind of stationary hay feeders for a lot of us. And so, we get the same spots where you start to get wear down. You start to get a lot of hay mixture falling there. So invariably, that's where all the weeds are going to go. It's not feasible to be able to come through and put a perennial grass like fescue there every year. You're just not going to get the staying power, and every year you're going to wear it down. So there's no point in wasting your money on putting a perennial there. But some of these strategies might be really good where this is where you could put in annual grass. So coming back through the spring, you feed there all winter, they wear it down. You're able to clean up some of that hay the late part of winter, early spring. You can come back in there and put in some spring oats or annual rye or something like that that you can get going. This will give you a nice little forage for some of those areas where, depending on how big your hay use area was, this will give you an opportunity to get some use out of that versus just being a weed patch or a brown spot through the spring. So this will give you some quality grass that'll be there through late spring or early summer, and where it'll start to play out. Another part where you might be able to see a good opportunity to use your annuals is if you've got some more warm season grasses. I'm always excited about using a Bermuda grass pasture. If you've got an opportunity, if you've got enough pasture to sacrifice some of it to be a warm season pasture, that's a great strategy to be able to take off the pressure for your fescue pastures during the summer. But the reason why a lot of people don't do that is they feel like they sacrifice a pasture that they can't use for 9 months of the year. They can only use it during those 3 hot months. And so that's where an annual can come through and provide a good opportunity. So you can come through there in late fall. You can overseed your Bermuda grass when it's starting to slow down. You're starting to get maybe some cooler weather, cooler nights. Come through there, overseed that, and you can have some good grazing on some of those pastures that you're using more towards the summer. So those are some good opportunities to be able to use the annuals. A lot of people ask about trying to use, doing an annual rotation in a field or a pasture. Um, I would not intentionally try to do an annual rotation. An annual rotation may be, once again, one of those annuals like winter wheat or oats or ryegrass, and then coming back in the summer and putting down like a crabgrass, Red River crabgrass, and then terminating that again in the late winter or late fall, and then coming back to that annual rotation. Yes, you're going to get a high quality forage throughout the year and a quality forage. But when you start penciling out the labor that it is, the time that it is, the inputs and fuel and tractor time, it just doesn't pencil out very well for a lot of people time wise. So using an annual strategy would be a very, very specific person, but using in spots, places like hay areas, as well as using them to overseed if you've got some exclusive warm season grass pastures would be a great opportunity to utilize annuals. Another strategy that I get really excited about is stockpiled fescue, and that is, it's got to be on the right year to be able to do this. Obviously, if we tried to do this last September, October, we would have been in trouble. I believe it was in the 90s through at least the first week or so, maybe 2 weeks of October. That gives us really no ability to stockpile, let alone replant any fescue. So something you have to look at is if you've already created, you've already done some reseeding before on a field, or you feel like you have a good pasture, and you feel like you have enough land. That's always the key when looking at stocking rate. Is do you want to stock to the max capacity of what you have for every acre of your field, or do you want to pull back a little bit on the head so that you can better utilize your entire pasture? Obviously, when prices are good, we want to load it up, and when prices are bad, we want to pull back as much as we can. We don't want to feed as many. But somewhere in the middle, for some, it might work better to put a few less head on there and be able to pull an extra pasture out that we can start to use for stockpiling. And that's basically a pasture that you can set aside. You come along in August, you hope we get some quality weather like we had. We've had a kind of a dream really rainy season. We've had a lot of rain um, right when we need it at most times. And so we've had some pretty good looking pastures coming through August. So as we do that, start looking at August, you have some potential. If you got a field that looks pretty good, that has a good stand of fescue grass in there, and fescue grass is important. It needs to be fescue. You can come through there and put, anywhere from, 30 to 50, 60 pounds of nitrogen on that grass, and then hold the cattle off until probably early November, late October for that. You'll be amazed by the growth that you get, especially if we're going to start getting some cooler evenings. We're still getting temperatures in the mid 70s to 80s, and cooler evenings. This fescue is really going to take off, and this would be a good opportunity to really grab hold of some free dollars. Of course, why do we stockpile fescue? We stockpile fescue so we don't have to feed hay as early, and that's the hope, is that if we can pull a month or two of feeding hay out, that'll really start to add to our pocketbooks. Okay, right now that really makes a big difference when we're looking at once again, the cattle prices they are. Where can we save a dollar or two? Well, when you start talking about um, how much cattle eat per, how many bales of hay cows eat per winter, and you're talking roughly at least a bale per cow per month. Anywhere from $40 to $50 on some of the bales today. So, that starts to add up pretty quickly. So, where's a nutrient that you already have in the ground that's sitting there for free that you're going to have to do something with right there? So, for the cost of some nitrogen, you can stockpile that, and you're looking at potentially, if everything falls right, of getting 2 free months, maybe November and a little bit of December, that you can get free forage for, that you already have sitting on your property. And it's quality forage. It's not that late summer. So we should have a good quality protein content, good quality energy content. It's going to be in the growth stage. But you can put those cattle out there and get some really good nutrition out of there. And so you're, looking on the screen here, we talk about just how much pounds of forage are actually pulling off their acreage. But you're talking a pretty good grazing efficiency of 65%. So you're still getting you're talking about 2,000 pounds that they're actually pulling off of it, off that 3,000 pounds. So that's a pretty good deal when it comes to that. Um, when you look at stockpiling, fescue, we're just kind of looking at breaking out some numbers, and these are some very general numbers that we have put in here. But looking at a good strategy of 1 acre per cow, and that's looking at trying to give you 2 months, and that's a quality, that's a well stockpiled fescue pasture. That's not a really thin stand. You have to have a pretty thick stand. So if it's something you've done in the last few years, reseeded, and you've managed it well, you can have that. And so once again, the challenge I realize is, as I sit here and speak to everybody, is not everybody has an acre per cow to be able to sacrifice and pull off and set aside and leave there. So, when we start talking about, is this strategy for everybody? Certainly it's not for everybody, because we don't all have that ability. But that's something that you can be planning for when you're determining your cow numbers. So if you're looking at this winter potentially of selling a few cows, maybe you pull them off a little bit earlier. Maybe you sell those. If you're planning on selling them, sell them a little bit earlier, pull those cows off, be able to stockpile some of those fields, so that the cows you are keeping, you won't have to pay as much to be able to feed. So these are all just little strategies to be thinking about as you're going on. Take what works for you. So when we start looking at, just an example here, very rough. I'm sure these numbers are different for everybody, and they may not be completely up to date with what you're going to go see at the local feed store that you're getting it, or nutrient supply. But 50 pounds of nitrogen, 30 acres, 35, probably even closer to 40 or above, at 30 acres is $1,000. and you look at what it costs to produce hay for 60 days, you're talking a little over $2,000. And so when you start breaking out the math, yeah, you have an opportunity to save over $1,000. When it comes to $40 a head, and I can guarantee you that we'd all love to see $40 extra a head, and that's just in one strategy. That's not doing any other strategies along the way. That's just taking advantage of the land that we all have to be able to grow some cattle. So everybody knows that it costs more money to produce hay than it does to graze the pastures. But sometimes you don't always get to see what those numbers look like in front of us. And so, you can very easily figure out what these answers and numbers are when you just figure out a bale per cow per month. You can start looking at it and start to come across what that looks like. But in the end, it may not be 1,000 exactly for you. It may be more than 1,000, but in the end, you are going to save some money. So look at that as a potential strategy that you can use this fall. When you start looking at rye or ryegrass, that's just looking at that that rough cost. And so that's an opportunity for you to decide if you want to put in one of those in your Bermuda grass pasture or someplace like that, where you can be able to pull that off. You're going to starting to graze that. It's going to be a pretty heavy producer. It's going to put 9,000 pounds per acre. You're going to get a 70% pull off. That's pretty heavy forage. So if you're looking at trying to capitalize in some areas that maybe you have some poor forage areas that you're not ready to completely reseed with fescue, there's a strategy here. So this is always, I enjoy always looking at this. Like I said, anytime you start breaking down things, everybody has their own thoughts on what the costs actually are. So sometimes you just have to pick a price and go with it. But when we look at this chart, there's a whole bunch of numbers going on here. But what the important thing to remember is it's talking about total yield, how many pounds are actually going to yield per acre, how many you're actually going to utilize, which we talked about being 65 to 70%, what it costs, per acre, when they're looking at putting the fertilizer on there. But in the end, what does it cost us per dry matter, per pound of dry matter? And you're talking, you start to get into some of these numbers over here. When you start to pull in your annuals, so these are just stockpiling some of your grasses and forages that you have out there that are perennials. We start looking at a winter annual. You see it costs about twice as much as stockpiled fescue. So it's more expensive. So obviously when you get the opportunity, we prefer fescue, but fescue doesn't always work for each strategy. The next best would be our winter annual. But then you come into what is it when you want to feed a strategy with fescue hay or Bermuda grass hay. And you look at, when you come along here and just look at the cost per pound of dry matter, it is double the price for fescue hay versus stockpiled fescue, double the price that you're paying. It's still, winter annual still better than feeding fescue hay. So if you get the opportunity to be able to put that in a spot that's appropriate, make sure it's an appropriate spot, then take advantage of that. But it just, I think it does a good job of highlighting what you're actually seeing when you go stockpile versus feeding hay. But it's not necessarily something you don't know already. We all know that anytime, the more times you put your hands on something, the more it costs, no matter what product it is. So, but I think it's more important to see just what the difference is in reality, not knowing that it's just cost more, but knowing how much it costs more. And so this is another way of breaking it out. We're just looking at that total cost per dry matter. And then just looking at what the break-even price is per ton. And I think some of you probably when you first look at this, you go, oh, $37. Well, I pay $30 a bale and I'm good. You look at that's $37 per ton. A lot of our bales may not be, probably are 1,000 or under. And so even if they're 1,000-pound bale, that is half a ton. So you're talking more like a $74 for those bales. So it's it's a little deceiving. So you look at what you have to purchase per ton at $37. I'm pretty sure most of us are not able to find high quality hay at $37 per ton. And so that's where you're starting to see down here is closer where you're starting to see for your fescue hay is what the actual price is when you're feeding that. So uh, the answer is that you can stockpile fescue and get a good opportunity, but it's got to fit your strategy. It's got to fit your farm plan. It's got to fit your lifestyle to be able to utilize this strategy. But it's always good to see it on the number side. So part of that next part is we talked about you get into planting. And so as you're trying to make that decision, am I going to plant? Am I going to stockpile? Am I going to try to feed hay? So what is my exact strategy? So one more strategy that we have to look at is whether to spray or not spray. And we put that in there before. That's why we talked about it at the very beginning is competition is the key. If the whole plan for your pasture strategy is I'm going to spray, you will fail um, your field. And that's because the ultimate goal is that you have enough grass that outcompetes the weeds, that outcompetes other grasses. And so when you do that, that is the goal. One of the tools that you have in your belt to help you is spraying. Spraying versus not spraying. Can you accomplish having a thicker stand of grass by putting all the right nutrients in and then trying to put a active and a very progressive mowing strategy where you try to keep the weeds, the weed head and the weed seed pressure down? Yes, but it doesn't work as fast, and it's probably not going to be as successful as utilizing a herbicide in your tool bag. You get a faster reaction, you get faster death of the weeds, and a faster and a quicker time you can put grass seed back in the ground and get that competition back up and going. But strictly trying to spray your way to a better quality field will be very difficult. Um, just like we mentioned before, this is not a perfect growing area for grasses. Fescue is our best option, but it is by no means a perfect option. It just does not have a long-term staying power. So you might see anywhere from 5 to 8 years that it starts to go downhill. If we get a really bad fall, if we get a lot of overgrazing, it's going to go down even faster. And so you're still going to have those holes where the rest of the weeds are going to compete. So if you put your number one long-term goal is to have a thick stand, then you can utilize herbicides as an opportunity. Mowing is always a good opportunity. Herbicides just get you there a little bit faster. But if you prefer kind of a more of an organic, natural way, you can certainly utilize a very intensive mowing schedule and reseeding schedule to try to get you there. But herbicides provide that. So, but don't make that your sole option for maintaining a quality pasture. But as we do it, you want to make sure that you properly identify the subject. And this is this is funny. If you'll notice the source at the very bottom, this came from a Tennessee third grade social studies textbook. If I have to explain it too much, then we probably should have started with genetics first. But those they probably aren't exactly the best milkers that we have in East Tennessee, and they are known for having some high quality cattle. But we do see this quite frequently is identify your subject. And when we start talking about this, it's more importantly to talk about it for grasses, but also for the weeds. Somebody will come in, I have a yellow flower, I sprayed for it in spring or I sprayed for it in summer. Why is it still here? Well, it has a yellow flower and that's the extent of it. That's true. These cows all have hair and they look like a cow, but I'm pretty sure that they're probably not the same cows that we're looking for when we're trying to describe dairy cows. So know the weed you're spraying for. Weeds have seasons just like grasses, and so there's a perfect time to spray each one of them, or there's a better time to spray each one of them, and they come up in different seasons. So have a yellow flower, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the same weed. So everybody needs a little amusement with that one. So I'm sure everybody has a story that they can tell um, regarding something funny that they've seen growing up in a textbook, and how they learned that it maybe was a little bit different once they got in the real world. But once again, right, we keep hitting back, right back. Pasture production is competition. Uh, your grass is competing. So you have this beautiful hayfield on the left, and you have uh, the invaders on the right, and they're looking for any opportunity they can to steal water, light, nutrients from the grass. If you have a quality field on the left, that grass is gonna steal the water, light, and nutrients. It's gonna be the bully. It's gonna take care of those weeds. But as soon as you give an inch, they're gonna take a mile. So don't give them an inch. Try to do your best to suppress them with spraying and then reseeding. So we'll just talk about cool season weeds just a little bit, because that's the season we've got coming upon us. Obviously, we have a whole nother season of weeds coming in from the summer, but the cool season is what's here today. You'll notice on this left-hand side, from January to early April, that's when those weeds are starting to really grow and germinate, are starting to grow. And then when you start to, obviously, April hits here, we have the beautiful picturesque sceneries that so many of our photographers all across the state love to utilize, which is the yellow buttercup that are in all of our fields during those times. So let's not give them near as many opportunities to have photo ops unless you can make a really good price off of it. But take advantage, look and see where they're growing. They're actively growing during that time that typically most of us think about, which is um, early spring, late winter. But more importantly, when we probably within the next couple of weeks, when we start to head out to our pastures and fields, you may not see them real easily, but if you get into the ground, you're going to notice that that's where a lot of our spring weeds are going to start popping up right now. And so that's one of our missed strategies that we have, is identifying that those weeds that we are seeing in the spring that are really coming on hot and heavy, when it's hard to get out there and spray because all the things that are going on, it's raining, we might have a wet spring, it's hard to get out and spray them. And so when they were little in late uh, February, early March, all of a sudden they have this beautiful flower in April, and then we'll say, well, next year I'm going to be on top of it. We're going to get them next year. Um, and so this is give you that strategy, is fall is not going to be hopefully typically as wet, and they are readily there. So we're going to talk about some opportunities to get them right now before they get into spring, where it's a little bit harder to get a hold of them. So um, one of the most popular, we can just talk about one of the most popular herbicides that we use, common one, 2,4-D. Um, there's two types of 2,4-D that are out there. Um, some of it just asks for 2,4-D, and we don't necessarily differentiate that there are two. And sometimes if you go to big box stores or some places that may have a new employee, they don't differentiate either. But do know that there are two types. There's an ester and there's an amine. The ester tends to have a little bit more efficacy, a little bit more effective. The amine is a little less volatile, a little bit safer to use. So um, we have different times and places for each one of these. For those that like little word associations, I always use ester before Easter. Ester is less volatile, more effective. So if you can get before Easter, 2,4-D ester is going to be a little bit more effective um, at controlling that. But like I said, it is more volatile. After Easter, we like to go to 2,4-D amine, especially if you're trying to spray in the summer, which means when I say it's volatile, it has the ability to move, not just drift, but kind of get up off the leaf and walk away to some other unintended plant, which is not ideal. So the ester has a real ability to do that. So please do not be spraying 2,4-D ester, even if you say, well, that's all I got over here, so I'm going to spray it. If you've got neighbors, there's a good chance that you may, affect something that they may have, tomatoes or something like that. So ester before Easter. Now, as the humidity starts dropping down, we can start looking at coming back into an ester formulation as we get into the later fall days. As we have these cooler temps, that's the key, is these cool temps. So you can start to bring that 2,4-D ester right back into your pocket. One of the things to be looking at, I believe this past Christmas, right around Christmas, maybe it was New Year's, I'm trying to remember, we had about 4 days where it was 60 and above. And so that's what you're looking for when we start talking about 2,4-D. So if you got an opportunity this late October, probably more like November, early December, somewhere in there, if you get 3 days, preferably 4, but if you get 3 days where it's a good 60 and maybe not dropping right after that, dropping down into freezing, but if you've got a slow transition, if you get 3 days, you can get out there and really do some damage to some of these weeds, especially if you start to get into buttercup, buckhorn. Buckhorn's a great one, where our fall sprays do a lot better than our spring sprays. So if you get 3, if you can get 4 days where the ambient daytime temperature gets up to 60 degrees, you can come in there and you can really do some damage to some of these weeds that you're starting to see in spring, but they're starting to pop up here probably in the next couple weeks. So take advantage of that opportunity. You get to use a stronger herbicide, and you get to knock them out when they're really young. That's the key. You start to get into spring, they start to grow, they start to get a little bit tougher, and it's really hard to be able to attack them. So get them when they're very young, and they're a lot more susceptible, because what's our cheapest number one option for using a herbicide? 2,4-D. Anything that you start using above that, whether you start going above the recommended rate, where you go from 2 pints per gallon or per acre to or 4 quarts per gallon. So it becomes more cost effective for you to spray them when they're young, and to use a cheaper herbicide. And there's kind of just a little bit of information, but as far as they get into the plant pretty quick. And so when we start looking at rain, when you're trying to scope out when the rain's coming, just like glyphosate, your Roundup, or anything like that, they actually get into the plant pretty quick. So I'm not saying rush out and do it 5 minutes before the rain comes, but you'd be surprised on how fast it actually gets inside the plant and gets active. So here's one of them that's very common, trying to get the buttercups. It is very, very effective. It's one of those that's still very effective on buttercups at the low rate. As you start to see 2 pints per acre, that is the lowest rate that I believe we have for 2,4-D. Why is that important? Clovers. Clovers are important because if you get above 2 pints per acre, you're probably going to be killing any and all your clovers. But if you stay at 2 pints, you probably will kill the crimson clover, but your white ladino clover will live. And so when we start talking about clovers as being an active part of our strategy, it's important. You don't want to spray something and be killing your clovers. You're kind of getting that vicious cycle over and over and over again. So you can look at using 2 pints per acre and still be able to have most of your clovers. So that's important. So if you can have another opportunity to have pretty effective weed control and maintain your clovers, that's a good strategy to have. As you start to get more weeds in your field, as you start to get stronger weeds that are less effective against 2,4-D, we have to up our rates. Buckhorn planting is a pain in the rear. We have some stronger herbicides that are pretty effective, but maybe no more effective than 2,4-D. And no matter which herbicide you're talking about using, they are more effective in the fall than they are in the spring when it comes to controlling buckhorn. And there's actually a few other weeds that are out there that you can do. And so for buckhorn, it may be one of those strategies, if you want to get rid of buckhorn, that you have to do a fall spraying and a spring spraying. It's just one of those that's very difficult to get rid of. But if you had to pick one spray to try to get rid of those, a fall would be more effective probably than a spring. But once again, you have to see them first. You can't just spray the ground and hope to get them. It has to make contact with the plants to be effective. And make sure that you add a surfactant with that. It allows it to really latch on and get into the system. Um, but you know, it's the same thing. And I think maybe on this next slide, maybe a little after that. So um, these are a couple weeds as we start looking at it that are really ones that are pretty susceptible during the fall. So buttercups, musk thistle, and buckhorn plantain, all ones that are very common that every one of us have coming up in the spring. So um, make sure that you prepare that. So when you start thinking about what you have that goes on in the spring versus winter, you know, this may be the better opportunity to do it when you look at the amount of time it has, you look at the rainy season. Um, so think about each one of those as you come up with that strategy. And what's your clover strategy? And I'll get into that clover right after this. So we're about to the conclusion of this. So as you be thinking about your questions, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this very last slide. This is not the last one. This is next to last. And so on this last slide, I'm going to kind of go over some strategies, but they're not all going to be just sitting in a PowerPoint. I just want to be able to talk through some of those. But it's important when just looking at the costs. I think it's important as we start going through each one of these just to get a roundabout idea what it costs. That's what most of us struggle with is being able to put a number to what each thing that we do, what does it cost? And so once again, you know, your chemical is going to be rough. You know, that's kind of looking at multiple different areas and providers, but you're talking close to $6 um, for 2,4-D. 2,4-D ester, roughly 2 pints per acre. It's going to cost you $6 per acre. And then if you look at what does it cost you to actually get the tractor up and going, that's not putting labor in there. That's just cost the fuel that you put in that tractor. What's that costing you? You run a 50 horsepower tractor, 2.5 gallons per hour. You're going 5 miles an hour. I'm sure some of you have some of those lead foots and push down a little bit faster than that. But we're going to use it based on the 5 miles per hour with a 30-foot sprayer, 10 acres per hour. You're talking about about 70 cents per acre at 2.75 a gallon. Obviously, that fluctuates and changes. 95 horsepower. Some of us like to have a little bit of that extra power in there. Going to cost us a little bit extra money there, but that's $1.18 per acre. So if you look at what the chemical costs and the fuel costs it takes you to do that, that can give you a better idea on which strategy you want to use. Do you want to spray a couple times for buckhorn plantain? Do you want to try to spray multiple times in the spring and the fall? Do you want to do one spray? What is your strategy? So you have an opportunity. When you start looking at going above 2,4-D rates, when you start going above the minimum rate to 4, you're killing your clovers. So that starts to not play as much of a role as determining which herbicide you want to use at that point. When you start doubling or even tripling the rate of 2,4-D, always, of course, utilizing the label as your guide, you start getting into the cost feasibility of some other herbicides. And the Grazon Next, if that one applies to you, obviously that one has a little bit more of a challenge when it comes to grazing or restrictions as far as manure and things that it can do from residual impacts. But you start getting into cost feasibility of some other herbicides. So 2,4-D is our cheapest one at the lowest rate. And that just gives you a breakdown of what you can see what it costs per acre. You can apply that to any one of the chemicals you have when you know what it costs you to start the tractor up, start around the field. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on getting started. This is our last slide, but I think it's important to think about when we're starting to do some of that reseeding is, what are some things that we need to be considering, or what are things that we need to have on our mind as we think about this? One, starting with a clean slate, no competition. Your field, your pasture may look like that. It may look like that in 2016. It may look like that now. Um, it depends on, your grazing, how much you've put on there. But more than likely, it's covered in a warm season grass, warm season weeds, whatever that may be. If you try to plant a seed, whether you drill it in or you broadcast it, even if you disc it, um, and you've got a thick stand of crabgrass or a thick stand of Johnson grass, that grass is just not going to grow. It's got too much competition from those weeds. Those other weeds are still in high production, and doesn't matter if you plant 25, 30 pounds to the acre of that fescue, you're not going to get any type of success. It's not going to be able to outcompete. So what you have to do is you have to be able to kind of clean this slate, clear it, and make it so that your grass has the best opportunity to really get up and going. So what can you do? Obviously, you can come in and spray and do a kind of a total renovation. That's probably one of the last strategies. If you have at least 30% of your fescue in your field, you probably don't want to be going to that strategy. It's an expensive way to go, and it's hard to always get a good stand starting back. So that may not be the first strategy you want to go with. Next one would be just trying to spray your weeds and then clip it as low as you can possibly go. Clip it and make sure that you have got it um, low as your mower will go. This will give the grass a good opportunity to get started. These cool nights will help. It will slow down the growth of some of these warm season forages, which will be really good. So as we start to get some of these cooler nights, less humidity, that grass will get up and go a lot quicker, and that those warm season grasses will slow down a lot. The challenge that you have with the clipping is if you did not start this strategy a while back and keeping that pasture pretty low, what you're going to get is clumps of grass that are left behind. So if you've got a big stand of Johnson grass or anything else like that, or a thick stand of crabgrass, it's going to be hard to get rid of those clumps of grass. Obviously, if you plant a seed in a clump of dead decaying grass, you obviously have nothing. So, and unless you're hiring an expensive landscaping company to come out there and rake it up, that's not going to work. So, one of the popular strategies that people use if you're really wanting to reseed a pasture and you've got a thick stand of crabgrass, Johnson grass more than likely, is you can come through and bale it as low as you can possibly go. Um, it won't be the highest quality hay. Some of that hay you may not even want to completely cure. It may be such poor quality forage that you just want to get it off there and put it in a wash area. But if you can get it out there, bale it. If you can get it to cure, uh, bale it, get it off there, and then be able to come back in. That will give you one of the best abilities to come through and freshly reseed your pasture. You've taken all that dead decaying mulch off of there, and you've given it a fresh start. You've really mowed it as lower than probably a batwing or a mower could go, a bush hog can go. So look at that option. So make sure you have a clean slate. You don't want any competition um, when you're first getting the new seedlings off and going. Always look for environment forecast. Take advantage when you can of Mother Nature. Right now, we had probably quite a few people doing a little reseeding. I was checking with the co-op. They had a lot of people buying seed this past week. Got ready for some of these weekend rains that we got, hoping to catch a little of the hurricane weather coming through. I don't know if we're going to get that. It looks like it may go around us this time. But we are getting the cooler nights. We are getting still nice warm daytime temperatures, but not scorching. It looks like in the 75 to 80 degree weather. So when it comes to reseeding, we're setting up for a really perfect fall to really get to take advantage of that. So long-term forecast, hopefully we'll have some rain coming up in the future, but the ground has some nice moisture to be looking at. That is key. You have to have a little moisture in the ground. If not, you're kind of planting in a dry bed. It's not going to really activate the germination. So right now we're really set in a great time. So hopefully some of you can take advantage of that right now. Environment and forecaster are on our team. Depth. This is probably the biggest reason why people get failure initially out of their um, initial seeding is they don't get the depth right. Most of us plant it way too deep, and it may not be. You may be that you set it at a quarter to at the most half an inch. I don't like to go completely a half inch on that, but a quarter is probably pretty good. Um, but we get it set too deep. So you set it at a quarter, but you didn't check the pressure on it. So the previous guy was trying to plow through concrete, and you got a local rain and this over the weekend, and you've got really soft, fertile soils, and you plow that right through, and it sets it down at an inch, and it's just not going to make it up out of the ground when you put it in at an inch. And so oftentimes you'll see that. So what you have to do is make sure, have somebody walk behind you and make sure that you can kind of be able to stick a knife in the ground and be able to almost see that seed sitting down inside that little slit. But that's probably one of the number one reasons why we get failure of stands to really germinate and go. It's not necessarily environment. Doesn't have to be rain all the time. It just gets planted too deep and people can't get it up. So don't be the only one doing it. You need to, or if you are, go a few feet, come back and check it. Get out of your tractor, come back and check and make sure that it's dropping the seed in there and it's not going very deep. You need to be able to access it within a quarter to at the very most half an inch. But make sure you check the pressure. Um, be very cautious when trying to put in fertilizer. If you're going to put on fertilizer with the new stands, you have to be very cautious. I don't get really excited about doing that. The reason why is if you've got a stand of a thinner stand of fescue and you put and you put new seedlings in there, if you get that fertilizer on too early and it's ideal for growing, that old stand is really going to take off and go, and it's going to overwhelm your new seedlings. So be very cautious if you're trying to look at trying to capitalize on the old stand as well as put in a new stand. You can't always do the same thing. You got to kind of pick, am I going to reseed or am I going to try to fertilize um, for like a stockpiled? You really can't do both at the same time with the same field. So be very careful of that. Mixing seed. When you start looking at mixing seed, we like hybrid vigor. For a lot of people, we like hybrid vigor. So hybrid vigor, and this would be mixing a couple of different types of seed. It might be mixing something like a ryegrass with a fescue. But we also get questions a lot of time about mixing. I want to do a fescue and I want to do clovers. So I'm going to put those both in together. Can I put those both in together and will it both plant and both grow? You can put them both in there. They will both plant. They will both grow. One will win. One enters or two enter the ring. One leaves. And so what happens is the fescue is going to really get going in the depending on what time of year. So we're going to get into, let's say we put them both in spring. You're going to have some of your older fescue is going to quickly overtake your clover. If you put clover and fescue in at the same time in the clover is going to grow a little bit quicker and it's going to overtake your grass seedlings. So you can't put those in at the same time. If you're looking to do a renovation with grass and clover, I look at putting the grass in this fall, and then I try to come through in late February, early March, and you kind of like that frost seeding, and put that clover out. But you cannot put them in at the same time. And the same thing, to be very cautious. I know we like to utilize the strategy of mixing fescue with some rye. And you'll see that in a lot of common mixes, and that's great. You'll get maybe 15% of it be rye, and it kind of takes up and going. Careful trying to do your own mix is that you don't want to get a very thick percentage of ryegrass in there, the rye grows a lot quicker than the fescue. So what happens is the rye grows real quick and overtakes the fescue. So if you do that, you want that to be a very, very small percentage as you're starting to buy that. So be careful when you're starting to look at buying mixes. Make sure that that rye is very, very small percentage, because you don't want it to overtake any of your fescue. So just be very cautious when you're mixing seeds. Make sure they have identical growing seasons, and make sure they're not in competition with each other. And just take advantage. Take advantage of the opportunities that you have. If you get an opportunity to go out there and seed right now, take advantage and do it. It might be an annual opportunity. It might be an opportunity to stockpile. It might be an opportunity to, reseed your pastures. But our pastures are not meant to be long-term sustainability where you don't have to put any type of inputs in there. You're always going to have to be working on top of them. You're always going to have to be trying to put some nutrients back in the ground. When it comes to spraying strategies or seeding strategies, everybody always asks, is it better to have clovers or is it better to spray and not have weeds? It's 6 of one, half a dozen of another. I like to maybe look towards the middle, is in the same way go with the spraying strategy. Spray heavy early on, kill a lot of those weeds. And then you can back off and use cheaper versions. If you've got a really, really strong weed pressure, use a stronger herbicide to be able to control some of the strong or tougher to kill weeds, and then back down into a cheaper one that you can start to control the weeds earlier on. When it starts to look at do you spray or do you put clovers in there? One of the things I always try to look at is maybe go towards a thick stand, try to have a thick stand of grass, spray towards that. As your stand starts to thin out a little bit, maybe that's when you start to come in and overseed with a few clovers. And so you're kind of using a little of both strategies. I don't like to necessarily pick one over the other to go kill a stand to put in clover or to turn it over to weeds so that I can have clover, or to be able to just say it's clover and have an influx of weeds coming across. So a lot of times it's picking middle of the road on a lot of these things. But either way, take advantage. Pick a strategy that works for you. Just don't sit on the sidelines year after year and think that it will get better and it will take care of itself. So you're constantly having to adjust. Just pick the one that works best for you. What I say in the end is, don't hesitate. I think in that email, I have provided my cell phone to everybody, especially the Williamson County people. I'm sure Kim has done that, or has provided a number to contact for the Rutherford County people in the class. I provide my cell phone. Don't ever hesitate. This is a good opportunity. If you want to just come out there, get a look at your field, see what you've got going on, or just talk about it. Just talk about different strategies that work for you. It's always helpful to hear somebody else's opinion. It is an opinion. That's all it is. It's worthless. It's about what you paid for it. But talk it out. I'm here to ask any questions, to answer any questions. But at this point, we'll be done. This will kind of cover our fall session. I know that there's so much more information in fall, but I think those are important strategies to be able to look at. And then as we start to go through winter, spring, and summer, we'll try to meet and talk a little bit about each one of those as we go, so that we can be only addressing what's going on or currently going to be going on in the near future.
Wow.
Hey, Matt, you've got a couple questions in the chat box.
I'm going to pull the chat up right now.
I think you can see both of them easily. If you can't, I have them wrote down.
Okay, I'm going to pull them up here. Let's see. Okay, so getting rid of sage and Johnson grass. So I think we talked about a little bit about sage and Johnson grass. There's a reason why we see them, is because they thrive in this environment. We talk about we're trying to get fescue to grow in an environment that's not ideal. Same from Bermuda and some of these other ones. But Johnson grass and sage really thrive. So you're really trying to take out the strong when you try to take out these two. But the key is they're only appearing after we have, sorry, I'm trying to mute some of this. They're only appearing after we start to get gaps in some of our forages, especially sage. Sage is a very opportunistic grass. It only appears when it's going poorly for everything else. So something to look at is, trying to maintain, try not to overgraze your pastures, trying to reseed when you can. I know a lot of people talk about sage being an indicator of lower pH, and that certainly is very common. And sorry, that certainly is very common. And but that's not the sole indicator of of having sage is low pH. Remember, low pH also means that it's ideal for weeds. So when you start looking at getting rid of sage, getting your pH correct, you can't kill sage by pouring a bunch of lime on it. So don't do that. It's expensive anyway. So get a thick stand of grass, and then get the right pH, which will help give you a thick stand of grass. That will help control sage. If you feel like you've just got an overrun stand, sometimes just termination is the best for that. When it comes to Johnson grass, that's one of those necessary evils. Again, we can either fight it or we can find a way to tame it. So there is no way to selectively, and nothing that is actively made on the market, that you can kill Johnson grass and not kill your fescue. They're both grasses, and we don't have any selective herbicide like that. You start to hear some outrider herbicides that can do that. They are not labeled for fescue pastures. They are not labeled to be able to do that. So until we keep hearing rumors that there's a few coming on the market, but that we've heard those rumors for a while. So when it comes to Johnson grass, it's trying to utilize it. Johnson grass can be a very high quality forage if you cut it at the right time. Obviously, if you wait to cut it when it's ideal for fescue, the Johnson grass is going to be too big. If you cut it when the Johnson grass is ideal, you may have your fescue being a little too small, a little immature before it's ready to go. Kind of depends on how much you have. If you have a good stand of Johnson grass and a weak stand of fescue, and you don't want to go through reseeding it, it might just be coming up with a strategy to be able to graze and to mow and bale the Johnson grass when it's at the right height, when it hasn't gone into seed. But it's one of those things where a lot of us have probably worked towards trying to utilize it as a forage versus trying to fight to get rid of it. It's just really hard to get rid of, but it can be a very high quality forage when you utilize it. Of course, this time of year, as we start to get to October, that's when you have to worry about prussic acid poisoning. So you want to make sure that's one of those summer grasses that as you start to see the frost hit, when you see that first frost that hits this heavy frost and you start to see that wilt, you want to make sure the cattle are off that for anywhere from 10 probably to 14 days if you've got a heavy stand of Johnson grass. Especially, let's say you have a heavy stand that you recently baled. Let's say you baled it in late September, early October, and it's just starting to grow and come back, and then we get an early frost in mid-October, and that's got a pretty fresh growth on it. If you see that, there's a good chance that any cattle eating that will get a prussic acid poisoning. You could always use the guinea pig method. That's my favorite method to be able to use. If you have that one cow that you plan on sending to the market either way, and you want to find out if you can get your cattle out on that pasture, you can send her out there to be the canary and lead the way. And if she lives, then maybe you can put the rest of your cattle out there. But if she keels over, then maybe look at waiting a few more days before you do that. So just be aware of that with Johnson grass. I digressed a little bit with the question, but that's always important this time of year. Handheld pH testers, there's just not a good reliable one. What you're trying to look at is pH anywhere from the top of the ground to 6 to 8 inches below that, and there's just not a pH tester that can provide that. So when we recommend doing soil testing, it's taking your hand, scooping it down from 6 inches all the way up to 1 inch, because you need to be able to tell the pH in all those different levels, because when we put lime on there, it's not instantaneous. It takes effects by months. and so it starts progressing its way down, and lowering the pH as it goes down. So there's just not really an effective way to do it very easily with a pH tester. A soil test is about the only way you can get a real accurate idea of what the pH actually is. Let's see. Grazon. Kenneth, I'm trying to make sure I understand Grazon versus spraying. So trying to use Grazon next, or HL, as a spraying tool. And of course, Grazon, the way, just to give a little history right now, Grazon is currently going to be coming off patent. They are replacing that. That company has replaced it with Duracor. Duracor is a product that is supposed to be very similar, a little different chemical formulation, but aminopyrrolide, which is the backbone of Grazon, which gives it that little bit of residual. A lot of people like Grazon. It's got a wider range of control of weeds and bigger weeds, but it also leaves a little residual. So most of our sprays are contact. Only if they hit a leaf do they kill it. This puts a little residual back in the ground and kills some of those weeds that we don't yet see. Duracor will have this same strategy, aminopyrrolide, on there with a different chemical formulation. But the challenge with Grazon is it's persistent. It stays with it. So if you cut hay off there and you sell that hay to somebody that has horses, those horses eat that hay, they drop the manure, they take the manure, they put it on their garden, all of a sudden you will not have a garden. Those tomatoes will be gone. If you spray Grazon, you get a little drift on the tomatoes. They won't have tomatoes this year. They probably won't have tomatoes next year. And then when it comes time to, if you put Grazon down and want it, let's say you put Grazon down in the spring or summer, maybe even fall, you will not be able to come back in and put any type of clovers in next spring, and it may be even longer than that. So we see at least a year, maybe even longer, before you can come back in and put clovers into those pastures. So Grazon is a great product. It's just one of those things, like everything else that we've talked about tonight. It is one strategy, one tool. You just got to make sure that it fits what you're doing. And Duracor would be the same thing. So if you don't have clovers and you want to get really good weed control, we talked about, it's one of those that when you start talking about putting 3 and 4 times the rate of 2,4-D, that's when Grazon can maybe take it to that next level when you talk about the price. So, using a stronger formulation early on to knock out some of those strong, big, tough weeds, and then backing it back down to a 2,4-D once you get control of your weeds. So I think I've got most of the questions in the chat box. Does anybody have any more that they want to ask, unmute and ask, or anything from any of the audiences that we have, either at the Williamson County Ag Expo Park or at the Rutherford County Extension office? Well, if nobody else has any questions, I will bid everybody adieu for the night. Hopefully we didn't have too many problems. Hopefully everybody was able to hear. I will stop the recording on this. I will load it, and then probably towards the end of this week, early next week, I will go ahead and get that loaded and have you guys available. And then I will send out, make sure, reminder, I need your BQA sheets for this, and then we'll make sure, and then we'll go through there and go through the class for that. Next week, we have Dr. Lou Strickland. We'll talk about animal health. More specific, we'll bore it down to a very specific topic issue, but this will be available, and then I will send the link for next week's meeting. So if no other questions, thank you guys, and we'll talk to you later. Remember, don't hesitate with any questions here on after. You've got my phone number. We're happy to talk at any time. Have a good night.